The wind whispered across Whisper Creek, bending the tall grass in gentle waves of gold and amber. It was the kind of wind that carried secrets, stories of blood spilled and promises broken. Silas Mitchell knew that wind well. It had been his only companion for 5 long years. Standing on the porch of his weathered cabin rifle resting in the crook of his arm, Silas watched the 3 riders approach along the ridge. They moved with the confidence of men who believed they owned not just the land beneath their horses' hooves, but every inch their eyes could see. The morning sun caught on something metal at Mason Hargrove's hip, a revolver polished to gleaming. At 50, Mason's hair had turned the color of winter frost, but his eyes remained sharp as a hawk's. Flanking him were his brother Fletcher, and one of his ranch hands, their expressions set like stone. Silas stood his ground as they reined in at the edge of his property, just before the wooden fence he'd spent 3 days mending last spring. "This is my land, Mason," Silas called out, his voice calm but firm. "The boundary ends at the creek." Mason Hargrove adjusted his hat, shielding his eyes from the sun, as he surveyed the Mitchell property, a modest cabin, a small barn in need of fresh paint and pastures that were a fraction of the Hargrove spread. "Not for much longer, Mitchell," Mason's voice carried easily across the distance. "You can't run forever." "I'm not running," Silas replied. "I'm standing right here." Mason's gaze traveled slowly across the property as if mentally claiming every fence post and blade of grass. "That deed of yours won't matter when the truth comes out." Silas tightened his grip on the Winchester. The truth already came out. 30 years ago. A shadow passed over Mason's face. "There's more than one kind of truth, boy." He turned his horse, gesturing for the others to follow. "We'll be back." Silas didn't move until the riders disappeared over the hill. Only then did he let out the breath he'd been holding, his shoulders dropping slightly. The encounter had gone as expected, threats veiled in cordial words, the same dance they'd been doing since Silas returned to his family land 5 years ago. As he turned to head back inside, something caught his eye, a dark splotch on the weathered wood of his fence post. He moved closer, running his fingers over the stain. It was tacky to the touch. Blood. Fresh blood. Silas scanned the horizon, eyes narrowing. Someone had been here, someone injured. And judging by the way the droplets continued beyond his fence line toward the east, they were still on his land. The abandoned train station at Eagle Creek stood like a monument to forgotten promises. Once it had represented progress and connection. Now its sagging roof and splintered platform served only as shelter for rattlesnakes and drifters. The rails that passed it had long since fallen silent, the last train having departed over 20 years ago. Silas followed the blood trail carefully, Winchester ready. The droplets grew more frequent as he approached the old station, suggesting whoever was wounded had slowed down, perhaps growing weaker. The silence was absolute as he stepped onto the creaking platform, broken only by the soft flutter of a tattered awning in the breeze. Then he heard it, a small sound, barely a whimper, coming from inside. He pushed the warped door open with the barrel of his rifle sunlight spilling into the dusty interior like water. What he saw stopped him cold. 2 young girls bound to a wooden post with rough hemp rope. Their small wrists were raw and angry where the rope had cut into them. The older one, perhaps 8 or 9, stood as straight as her bonds would allow, chin trembling but held high. The younger, no more than 5, pressed her cheek against the post. Eyes wide with fear. A few feet away, a woman lay face down in the dirt, dark hair matted with blood and dust. Her dress was torn at the hem, revealing bruises in ugly shades of purple and yellow. She drew shallow, labored breaths, Take our mother, the older girl said, her voice thin but steady. She's dying. Silas lowered his rifle slowly, unable to comprehend the scene before him. Who did this to you? He asked, approaching cautiously. The older girl watched him with eyes too old for her face. Uncle Fletcher, she said. Mama's brother. Silas knelt before them, pulling his hunting knife from his belt. The younger girl flinched as he raised it, but he moved slowly, cutting through their bonds with care. I'm Silas, he said, examining their raw wrists. What's your name? Eleanor. The older girl answered immediately, moving to rub her sister's arms once free. This is Charlotte. She doesn't talk. Charlotte kept her eyes on the floor, thin shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. Silas moved to the unconscious woman, gently turning her over. Her face was bruised, a cut above her eyebrow still seeping blood. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck, relieved to find a pulse, though it fluttered weakly beneath his touch. Your mother, he said, looking back at the girls. What's her name? Rebecca. Eleanor replied, helping Charlotte to her feet. Uncle Fletcher said she wasn't family anymore, that she betrayed them. Silas poured a little water from his canteen between Rebecca's cracked lips, watching as she swallowed reflexively. How long have you been here? Since yesterday, Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a whisper. They left us to die. Something cold settled in Silas's chest, a familiar anger he'd been carrying for years. Without another word, he gathered Rebecca in his arms. She weighed little, as if grief had hollowed her out from the inside. Can you walk? He asked the girls. Eleanor nodded, taking Charlotte's hand firmly in her own. Where are you taking us? Somewhere safe. Silas replied, though he wasn't sure such a place existed anymore in Whisper Creek. The journey back to Silas's cabin was slow. Rebecca remained unconscious, cradled against his chest, as he led his horse with Eleanor and Charlotte walking beside him. The girls kept pace without complaint, though their bare feet must have been tender on the rocky path. As they crested the final hill, Silas's property came into view, modest but well kept, a testament to the pride he took in maintaining what little remained of the Mitchell legacy. The cabin stood sturdy against the backdrop of distant mountains, smoke still curling from the chimney where he'd left a fire burning that morning. Is this your home? Eleanor asked, eyes scanning the unfamiliar territory with the wariness of a hunted animal. It is now, Silas replied. It was my father's before me. He carried Rebecca into the cabin, laying her gently on his bed. The room was sparse, but clean. A wooden table with 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove shelves lined with supplies, and his bed covered with a quilt his mother had made long ago. Eleanor and Charlotte stood in the doorway, hesitant to enter, as if expecting to be turned away at any moment. Silas motioned them inside. You 2 sit by the fire, he said, gesturing to the small hearth. I'll tend to your mother. As the girls settled on the rug before the fire, Silas gathered what medical supplies he had: clean cloths, a bottle of whiskey, and a tin of salve he'd made from herbs gathered in the foothills. His hands trembled slightly as he began cleaning Rebecca's wounds, memories of another woman's injuries flooding back: Catherine, his wife, bleeding out in his arms 5 years earlier. Will she die? Eleanor's question cut through his thoughts. Silas looked up, meeting the girl's steady gaze. Not if I can help it. As he worked, he noticed Charlotte watching his every move, her small face solemn. She clutched a worn rag doll, missing one button eye, holding it against her chest like a shield. Your sister, Silas said to Eleanor, has she always been quiet? Eleanor's expression darkened. Since that night, the night Papa disappeared. Silas nodded, understanding more than he let on. Trauma could steal a child's voice as surely as a thief in the night. With Rebecca's wounds cleaned and bandaged, Silas moved to examine the girls. Eleanor had bruises on her arms and a healing cut on her shoulder. Charlotte appeared physically unharmed, but flinched at his approach. "I won't hurt you," he assured them, voice gentler than he'd used in years. "Are you hungry?" Both girls nodded, eyes brightening at the mention of food. Silas set about preparing a simple meal: beans, cornbread, and the last of his dried venison. As he worked, he felt Eleanor's curious gaze following him. "You live here alone?" she asked. "Yes," Silas replied, not elaborating. "No wife, no children." His movements stilled momentarily. "Not anymore." Something in his tone must have warned her not to press further, for Eleanor fell silent, turning her attention to comforting Charlotte instead. As Silas placed bowls before the girls, he caught a flicker of movement through the window. Standing on the ridge overlooking his property was a lone rider silhouetted against the setting sun. Even at this distance, Silas recognized Adam Hargrove Mason's youngest son. The young man sat motionless on his horse for several minutes, watching the cabin before turning and disappearing back over the hill. Silas knew what it meant. The Hargroves were aware he'd found Rebecca and the girls. The message was clear. This isn't over. Later, as the girls slept on a pallet he'd made near the fire, Silas searched Rebecca's pockets for anything that might explain their situation. In the inner pocket of her torn jacket, he found a folded piece of paper, part of an old map by the looks of it with strange markings, and the words, "Third Hill, when the sun touches the peak," written in faded ink along one edge. The paper had been torn, as if someone had ripped it in half. Silas studied it in the dim light, unable to make sense of the markings or determine what location it depicted. But one thing was clear: whatever this map led to, it was valuable enough for someone to harm a woman and leave 2 children to die. Night settled over Whisper Creek like a heavy blanket, stars pricking the inky darkness one by one. Silas sat on his porch rifle across his knees, listening to the nocturnal symphony of crickets and distant coyotes. Inside, Rebecca still hadn't regained consciousness, though her breathing had steadied. The girls slept fitfully, Charlotte whimpering occasionally in her dreams. From his shirt pocket, Silas withdrew a small wooden box worn smooth from years of handling. Opening it revealed a delicate handkerchief embroidered with the name Catherine, and a silver half-moon pendant on a fine chain. The pendant had a tiny keyhole, though Silas had never found the key to match it. These were all he had left of his wife, that, and the memories that haunted his sleep. Catherine had died in a raid on their homestead near Cheyenne 5 years ago. Silas had been checking fence lines when the attackers came. By the time he returned, the house was ablaze and Catherine lay bleeding on the ground, shot through the chest. He'd tried to save her, desperately, pressing his hands against the wound as if he could physically hold her life inside her body. But she'd slipped away, her blood soaking the ground as he begged her to stay. Afterward, he'd tracked the raiders for 3 months, only to discover they'd been hired by a cattle baron trying to drive out small ranchers. The man had connections that kept him from justice, and Silas had nearly gotten himself killed seeking vengeance. Eventually, he'd returned to his father's old property, this cabin in Whisper Creek Hollow, and determined to live alone. Now looking at the silver pendant gleaming in the moonlight, he wondered what Catherine would think of his self-imposed isolation. She'd always believed in helping others, even strangers. The measure of a man, she'd once told him, isn't what he builds for himself, but what he does for those who can build nothing. The creak of floorboards inside alerted him to movement. Setting aside the box, he rose and entered the cabin quietly. Rebecca was awake, attempting to sit up despite her injuries. "Easy," Silas said, moving to her side. "You're safe." Rebecca's eyes, a deep amber in the firelight, widened with fear. "My daughters are sleeping," he assured her, gesturing to the pallet where Eleanor and Charlotte lay curled together. "They're unharmed." Relief washed over her face, followed quickly by suspicion. "Who are you? Where am I?" "Silas Mitchell. This is my ranch." He offered her water, which she accepted with trembling hands. "I found you and your girls at the old Eagle Station. You were unconscious." Rebecca drank deeply, wincing as the movement pulled at her injuries. "How long have I been here?" "Since this morning." "Your daughter said Fletcher Hargrove did this to you, said he's your brother." A shadow crossed her face. "Half-brother," she corrected, voice hardening. "Though he's no family of mine now." "Why would he leave you to die?" Silas asked. Rebecca looked away, hands clutching the blanket. "He said 300 head of cattle were worth more than our lives." Her voice broke slightly. "After my husband disappeared, Fletcher claimed the girls and I had no right to remain on Hargrove land. When I disputed him, he—" She trailed off, fingers brushing the bruises on her neck. "Your husband," Silas prompted. "What was his name?" "Daniel," she whispered. "Daniel Mitchell." The name hit Silas like a physical blow. "Mitchell." Rebecca met his gaze, something like recognition dawning in her eyes. You're Daniel's brother, the one he spoke of." Silas stared at her, mind racing. Daniel had been gone for nearly 10 years, having left Whisper Creek after a bitter argument with their father. Silas had received exactly 3 letters from him over the years, the last one 5 years ago, mentioning a wife but giving no details. He'd assumed Daniel had started a new life somewhere far from Wyoming. "Daniel is my brother," Silas confirmed, voice tight, "but I haven't seen or heard from him in years. Last I knew, he was in Denver." "We met there," Rebecca said, a sad smile touching her lips. "He was working as a surveyor. We married quickly, perhaps too quickly. He rarely spoke of his past, only that he had unfinished business in Wyoming." Her expression clouded. "3 months ago, he insisted we come here, said it was time to make things right. And then he disappeared," Silas finished for her. Rebecca nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Fletcher claims he abandoned us, but Daniel would never—" She stopped, overcome by emotion. "What do you think happened to him?" Silas asked gently. Rebecca's eyes met his, filled with a terrible certainty. "They killed him," she whispered. "They killed Daniel. They think he told me where it is." "Where what is?" But Rebecca had already said too much. She closed her eyes, exhaustion claiming her once more. "They're watching," she murmured as she drifted off. "Always watching." Silas remained by her side, mind reeling with questions. His brother married to a Hargrove. His brother possibly murdered. And now his brother's wife and daughters under his protection, whether he wanted the responsibility or not. Outside, an owl called into the darkness. Silas moved to the window, scanning the moonlit landscape. Nothing moved, yet he couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. Rebecca's words echoed in his mind, "They're watching." He checked his Winchester, making sure it was loaded, before settling into the chair beside the bed. Sleep would not come easy tonight, if at all. Dawn broke over Whisper Creek in a wash of pale gold and lavender. Silas, who had dozed fitfully in the chair, woke to the sound of movement. Charlotte stood at the window, her small face pressed against the glass, as she watched a deer graze at the edge of the property. "Morning," Silas said softly, not wanting to startle her. Charlotte turned, regarding him with solemn eyes, but offering no response. She held her rag doll close, its one-button eye seeming to study Silas with equal intensity. Eleanor stirred on the pallet, immediately alert. Her first instinct was to check on her mother, who still slept, before acknowledging Silas with a cautious nod. "Hungry?" he asked, moving to stoke the fire. Eleanor nodded, taking Charlotte's hand and guiding her to sit at the table. The younger girl went willingly, though her eyes never left Silas as he prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush with the last of his molasses. As they ate, Silas noticed how Eleanor carefully made sure Charlotte had enough, putting her sister's needs before her own, a child forced to become a caretaker far too young. "Your mother should eat when she wakes," Silas said, setting aside a portion. "She needs strength to heal." Eleanor studied him over her bowl. "Why are you helping us?" The question, direct and unvarnished, was typical of children who had learned early that adult kindness often came with conditions. Silas considered his answer carefully. "Because you needed help," he said simply. "And because Daniel was my brother." Eleanor's expression remained guarded. "Papa said his family was all gone." "He thought so, maybe," Silas replied. "We hadn't spoken in many years." "Because of the fight with your father," Silas raised an eyebrow. "He told you about that?" Eleanor shook her head. "I heard him telling Mama. He said his father chose the wrong side." Before Silas could ask what she meant, a soft cry from the bed drew their attention. Rebecca was awake, trying to sit up despite her injuries. Silas moved to help her, supporting her back as she adjusted to an upright position. "Eleanor, Charlotte," she called, voice raspy with pain and thirst. "We're here, Mama," Eleanor assured her, bringing a cup of water. Rebecca drank gratefully, eyes darting around the unfamiliar cabin before settling on Silas. "It wasn't a dream then," she murmured. "You really are Daniel's brother." "Yes," Silas confirmed, stepping back to give her space. "Though, as your daughter pointed out, we weren't close in recent years." Rebecca beckoned the girls to her side, examining them with a mother's careful eye before hugging them close. "Thank God you're safe," she whispered against Eleanor's hair. Watching the reunion, Silas felt a familiar ache in his chest, the hollow space where his own family should have been. He turned away, busying himself with clearing the breakfast dishes to give them privacy. Outside, the day had brightened, promising fair weather. Silas stepped onto the porch, scanning the horizon habitually for any sign of riders. The land was quiet, nothing moving except a hawk circling lazily above the distant creek. The peace was broken by the patter of small feet behind him. Charlotte had followed him outside, clutching a piece of paper and a stub of charcoal. Without a word, she sat on the porch steps and began to draw. Silas watched, curious, as the child's small hands moved confidently across the paper. Gradually, an image took shape, a tall man standing beneath a large tree, something buried at its base. "That's good," Silas commented, crouching beside her. "Who's the man?" Charlotte didn't answer, focused intently on her drawing. She added more details. The tree had a cross carved into its trunk, and nearby was what appeared to be a small stream. "Is that your pa?" Silas tried again. Charlotte looked up at him, her eyes conveying what her voice could not. She nodded once, then returned to her drawing. The door opened behind them, and Eleanor stepped out immediately, moving to her sister's side. "Mama's asking for you," she told Silas. Inside, Rebecca sat propped against pillows, color returning slightly to her cheeks. She watched Silas approach, eyes calculating. "We need to leave," she said without preamble. "As soon as I can travel. It's not safe for you to harbor us." Silas pulled up a chair beside the bed. "You're in no condition to travel, and you have nowhere to go. The Hargroves would find you before you reached the next town. You don't understand what they're capable of, Rebecca insisted, lowering her voice. What they've already done. Then help me understand, Silas countered. What happened to Daniel? And what did you mean last night about them thinking he told you something? Rebecca hesitated, conflict evident in her expression. Finally, she sighed. Daniel found something the Hargroves have been searching for a long time. He wouldn't tell me what exactly, only that it could change everything. And they killed him for it. I believe so. Her voice trembled. 3 months ago, he rode out to meet Fletcher, saying it was time to end the feud. He never returned. She clutched the blanket tightly. Fletcher claimed Daniel had run off, abandoned us. But I found blood on Daniel's saddle when they returned it to me. And this. She reached beneath her blouse, wincing with the effort, and withdrew a small object. A key, tiny and ornate, attached to a leather cord around her neck. Daniel gave this to me the morning he left. Said if anything happened to him, I should find his brother and show him this. Silas stared at the key, realization dawning. It was the perfect size for the keyhole in Catherine's pendant. Did he say what it unlocks? He asked, voice rough. Rebecca shook her head. Only that it was part of his inheritance. Fletcher saw it once and became obsessed, demanding to know what it opened. When I wouldn't tell him, couldn't tell him, she gestured to her bruised face. And the map fragment in your pocket. Rebecca's eyes widened. You found it? Yes, it seems important. It is. Daniel believed it leads to something hidden on Mitchell land, something both our families have sought for generations. She leaned forward, eyes intense. Silas, they will kill for this. They already have. Before Silas could respond, a shout from outside pierced the quiet. Eleanor's voice, high with alarm. Mr. Mitchell Ryder's coming! Silas grabbed his rifle and moved swiftly to the door. From the porch he could see 3 figures approaching Mason Hargrove again, flanked this time by his son Adam and another ranch hand. They rode slowly, deliberately, making no attempt to conceal their approach. Stay inside, Silas told the girls, positioning himself on the porch steps, rifle held casually but ready. Mason reined in his horse at the gate, the same spot he'd stopped the previous day. His cold eyes scanned the property, lingering on the cabin where Rebecca and the girls were hidden. Mitchell, he called, his deep voice, carrying easily across the yard. I believe you have something that belongs to the Hargrove family. I have nothing of yours, Silas replied evenly. Mason's smile didn't reach his eyes. My brother's sister-in-law and her children are sheltering on your property. Family matters should be handled by family. From what I understand, you forfeited the right to call them family when you left them to die. A flicker of something, perhaps surprise, crossed Mason's weathered face. Dramatic tales from a hysterical woman. Rebecca has always been prone to exaggeration. The rope burns on those children's wrists weren't an exaggeration, Silas said, anger seeping into his voice. Mason sighed as if dealing with a particularly stubborn child. What happens in the Hargrove family is Hargrove business. I'm giving you one chance to stay out of it. Return them to us, and we'll forget this unfortunate incident. They're not going anywhere. Mason studied him for a long moment, then nodded as if coming to a decision. You're making a mistake, Mitchell. One you'll regret. He turned his horse, gesturing for the others to follow. We'll be watching. As they rode away, Silas noticed Adam Hargrove glancing back, his expression unreadable. Unlike his father, the young man seemed conflicted, almost reluctant. Inside the cabin, Rebecca stood leaning against the doorframe, face pale but determined. They'll be back, she said quietly. With more men next time. Silas nodded, knowing she was right. Then we'd better be ready. The following day brought no further visits from the Hargroves, but Silas felt their presence like a storm on the horizon, unseen but inevitable. He spent the morning reinforcing the cabin's defenses as best he could, checking sight lines and planning escape routes should they become necessary. Rebecca rested her strength, returning slowly. The girls helped where they could, Eleanor fetching tools and water, Charlotte silently following Silas like a shadow, observing his every move. Around midday, Silas noticed Charlotte had wandered to the edge of the property where she sat in the tall grass drawing. Curious, he approached, careful not to startle her. The new drawing showed the same tree and man, but with more details. The tree stood beside a creek, and in the background was what appeared to be a hill with 3 distinct peaks. "Is this a real place?" Silas asked, crouching beside her. Charlotte nodded without looking up, adding more details to the drawing. "Somewhere near here." Another nod. "Is it important? Something to do with your pa?" Charlotte finally met his gaze, her eyes conveying a depth of understanding that belied her young age. She pointed to the tree in her drawing, then to the east, toward the boundary between Mitchell and Hargrove land. Silas followed her gesture, realization dawning. "The hanging tree," he murmured. The old oak stood at the edge of Mitchell property, near where the creek formed a natural boundary. It had earned its grim name 30 years ago, when a rustler had been hanged from its sturdy branches. Some claimed the man's ghost still haunted the area, his spirit unable to cross the creek into the afterlife. Charlotte's insistent tugging on his sleeve brought Silas back to the present. She was pointing to the tree again, then making a digging motion with her hands. "Something's buried there. Is that what you're saying?" Charlotte nodded vigorously, relief evident in her expression at being understood. "Did your pa bury something there?" Another nod accompanied by a solemn look that conveyed the importance of this information. "Does your Uncle Fletcher know about this?" Charlotte's expression darkened, and she shook her head firmly. Silas studied the drawing again, noting how precisely the child had captured the landscape. If Daniel had hidden something at the hanging tree, it could explain many things: his return to Whisper Creek, his meeting with Fletcher, his subsequent disappearance. "Thank you for showing me this," Silas said gently. "This might help us understand what happened to your pa." Charlotte offered him the smallest of smiles, the first he'd seen from her, before returning to her drawing, adding what looked like a small box beneath the tree. That evening, as Rebecca sat on the porch watching the sunset, Silas showed her Charlotte's drawing. "The hanging tree," Rebecca murmured, tracing the outline with her finger. "Daniel mentioned it once, said it marked the spot where everything went wrong." "Between our families, you mean?" Rebecca nodded. "He never gave me details, only that there was bad blood stretching back to your grandfather's time." "That's putting it mildly," Silas said, taking a seat beside her. "The feud started over land and water rights like most disputes out here. But it became something uglier when my grandfather accused Mason's father of stealing cattle. Words led to guns, and both men ended up dead. And the next generation continued the hatred," Rebecca finished softly. "My father and Mason's never reconciled. They passed the bitterness down to their sons." Silas glanced at her. "Except Daniel, it seems. He married into the enemy camp." A sad smile touched Rebecca's lips. "He never told me his family name until after we were wed. Said it would only complicate things." She looked out over the darkening land. "When he finally suggested coming back here, I thought perhaps he wanted reconciliation. Instead, he found death," Silas said grimly. Rebecca's hand found his arm, her touch tentative. "I'm sorry about Daniel. Whatever happened between you, I know he loved you. He spoke of you often." Silas remained silent, throat tight with emotions he'd long suppressed. The brother he'd idolized as a boy had become a stranger, and now he would never have the chance to bridge that gap. The screen door creaked as Eleanor stepped onto the porch, Charlotte in tow. "Mama, it's time for your medicine," she announced, holding a cup of the herbal tea Silas had prepared earlier. As Rebecca dutifully drank, Eleanor settled beside her, sharp eyes taking in the drawing still in Silas's hands. "Charlotte's been drawing that tree for months," she remarked, "ever since Papa took us there." Silas looked up, interest piqued. "Your father took you to the hanging tree?" Eleanor nodded. "Just once. He said he needed to check something. He made us wait by the creek while he—" She hesitated, glancing at her mother. "While he— what?" Silas prompted gently. "While he dug under the tree," Eleanor finished, voice dropping to a whisper. "He told us not to tell anyone, not even Mama. But I don't think it matters now, does it?" "Did he find what he was looking for?" Rebecca asked clearly, hearing this for the first time. Eleanor shrugged. "I don't know. He put something in his pocket. Then we went home, and he seemed different, worried." "When was this?" Silas asked. "The day before he disappeared," Eleanor replied, tears welling in her eyes. "The day before Uncle Fletcher killed him." A stunned silence followed her words. Charlotte moved closer to her sister, taking her hand in silent support. "Eleanor," Rebecca said carefully, "we don't know for certain what happened to your father." "I do," Eleanor insisted, a tear spilling down her cheek. "I heard Uncle Fletcher talking to Grandfather Mason. He said Papa wouldn't be a problem anymore, that they could finally claim what was rightfully theirs." Rebecca pulled her daughter close, stroking her hair as she sobbed. Over Eleanor's head, she met Silas's gaze, her eyes reflecting the same grim certainty he felt. Daniel had been murdered, and whatever he had found at the hanging tree was the reason why. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, the kind of autumn day that reminded Silas why he'd returned to Wyoming, despite all the painful memories it held. The mountains stood sharp against the blue sky, their peaks dusted with the first snow of the season. He rose early, checking the perimeter of his property before the household awoke. No sign of Hargrove men, though he knew they were out there watching and waiting. Returning to the cabin, he found Rebecca already up, moving gingerly, but with determination as she prepared breakfast. The bruises on her face had faded to yellowed shadows, and though she still winced with certain movements, her recovery was progressing faster than he'd expected. "You should be resting," he admonished gently. Rebecca offered a small smile. "I've never been good at being idle. Besides, you've done enough for us already." The girls emerged from the loft where they'd slept, Charlotte rubbing sleep from her eyes, while Eleanor immediately moved to help her mother. As they ate, Silas considered their next move. "I need to go to town today," he announced. "We're low on supplies, and I should find out what's being said about your situation." Rebecca's expression tightened with worry. "It's not safe. The Hargroves have eyes everywhere." "All the more reason to know what we're facing," Silas countered. "Besides, we need flour and coffee, and proper clothes for the girls." After some discussion, it was decided that Eleanor would accompany Silas, while Rebecca and Charlotte remained at the cabin. The older girl had insisted on coming, her chin set in a stubborn line that reminded Silas painfully of Daniel. "I need to do something," she'd declared. "I'm tired of hiding." An hour later, they set out for Redemption, a small town nestled in the valley 8 miles east. Eleanor rode behind Silas on his horse, her small hands gripping his belt for balance. She remained silent for most of the journey, but as the town came into view, she spoke up. "People won't like that you're helping us," she said matter-of-factly. "The Hargroves own half this town." "Let them dislike it," Silas replied, doesn't change what's right. Eleanor considered this. Papa said that too. That's why they killed him. Silas reined in his horse, turning slightly to look at her. Eleanor, I promise you, if Fletcher Hargrove harmed your father, he'll answer for it. But we need proof. The girl nodded solemnly. I'll help you find it. Redemption consisted of one main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a general store saloon, blacksmith, small church, and sheriff's office. As Silas and Eleanor rode in, he felt the weight of curious stares. News traveled fast in small towns, and their arrival was clearly expected. They dismounted outside Sullivan's general store. Before entering, Silas knelt to Eleanor's eye level. "Stay close," he instructed. "Don't wander off no matter what." Inside, the store fell silent as they entered. Mrs. Sullivan, a plump woman with sharp eyes and sharper tongue, stood behind the counter. Several other customers browsed the shelves, though Silas suspected they were more interested in gossip than goods. "Mr. Mitchell," Mrs. Sullivan greeted, her gaze shifting to Eleanor. "And Miss Hargrove, I presume." "Mitchell," Eleanor corrected quietly. "My name is Eleanor Mitchell." A murmur rippled through the store at this declaration. Mrs. Sullivan's eyebrows rose, but she nodded. "Of course. What can I help you with today?" Silas listed their needs: flour, coffee, sugar beans, ammunition for his Winchester, and clothes for Eleanor and Charlotte. As Mrs. Sullivan gathered the items, the bell above the door jingled, announcing another customer. Sheriff Luther Collins stepped inside, thumbs hooked in his belt. At 60, Collins was still an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered with a silver mustache and eyes that missed nothing. He'd been sheriff of Redemption for over 15 years, maintaining a careful neutrality in the Mitchell-Hargrove feud. "Mitchell," he acknowledged, his gaze lingering on Eleanor. "Heard you had guests." "News travels fast," Silas replied evenly. Collins shrugged. "Small town, smaller minds sometimes." He moved closer, lowering his voice. "Mason Hargrove was in my office yesterday, making some serious accusations. Said you'd kidnapped his granddaughters." "That's a lie," Eleanor interjected, eyes flashing. "He left us to die." Collins studied her for a moment, then nodded slightly. "So I figured. The Hargroves have their version of events. I reckon you have yours." He straightened, speaking at normal volume again. "Just keep the peace in my town, Mitchell. That's all I ask." As Collins left, Silas noticed a tenseness leave Eleanor's shoulders. "Is he a friend?" she asked quietly. "Not exactly," Silas replied. "But he's fair, and that's something in these parts." They finished their shopping without further incident, though Silas was acutely aware of whispers following them. As they loaded their supplies onto the horse, the door of the church across the street opened, and an elderly man in clerical collar emerged. "Reverend Abernathy," Silas acknowledged with a nod. The Reverend approached, his kind face creased with concern. "Mr. Mitchell, it does my heart good to see you in town." His gaze shifted to Eleanor. "And this must be one of Daniel's girls. The resemblance is striking." Eleanor looked up sharply. "You knew my father." "Indeed I did, child. I performed his marriage to your mother in Denver at his request." The old man's eyes held a sadness that suggested he knew more than he was saying. "How is Rebecca faring?" "Recovering," Silas replied. "You've heard what happened, I assume?" Abernathy nodded gravely. "The Lord sees all, even when men think their deeds are hidden in darkness." He placed a gnarled hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "Your mother is welcome at my church any time, as are you and your sister. The Hargroves hold no sway over God's house." As they prepared to leave town, Silas felt a prickling sensation between his shoulder blades, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Turning, he spotted Fletcher Hargrove standing outside the saloon, a sneer twisting his features. Unlike his older brother, Mason, Fletcher was lean and wiry, with sharp features and eyes that burned with barely contained malice. At 45, he had the weathered look of a man who'd lived hard and harbored grievances. "Mitchell," he called, pushing away from the hitching post and approaching. "Out shopping with stolen property." Silas positioned himself between Fletcher and Eleanor. "Go back to your whiskey, Fletcher. You're not welcome here." Fletcher's smile was cold. Hargrove children belong with Hargroves. It's a simple truth. Even a Mitchell should understand. "They're Mitchell children," Silas corrected, "and they're under my protection now." Something dangerous flashed in Fletcher's eyes. "Protection, like you protected your wife." He chuckled at Silas's shocked expression. "Oh yes, I know all about Catherine, how you failed her, how you let her die while you were off mending fences." Eleanor gripped Silas's hand tightly, sensing the tension. "We should go," she whispered. Fletcher's gaze dropped to the girl. "Your mother filled your head with lies, Eleanor. Your father abandoned you, ran off with another woman. Ask Mitchell here if that doesn't run in the family." "That's enough," Silas growled, hand dropping to his holster. "Is it?" Fletcher's smile widened. "We've only just begun, Mitchell. Your brother stuck his nose where it didn't belong, and look what happened to him. Consider that a warning." With that, he turned and sauntered back to the saloon, leaving Silas shaking with fury, and Eleanor pale with fear. The ride back to the cabin was silent, both lost in their own thoughts. As they crested the final hill, Eleanor finally spoke. "Was he telling the truth about your wife?" Silas's hands tightened on the reins. "Some of it. She did die while I was away from the house. I couldn't save her." "I'm sorry," Eleanor said softly. "Mama says people say cruel things when they're afraid." "Afraid?" Silas glanced back at her. What would Fletcher Hargrove have to fear? Eleanor's expression was far too knowing for her years. "That we'll find what Papa hid. That everyone will know what he did." As they approached the cabin, Silas noticed fresh tracks in the dirt. Someone had been there during their absence. Drawing his revolver, he dismounted, helping Eleanor down. "Stay behind me," he instructed, approaching cautiously. The door stood ajar, though he'd left it locked. Heart pounding, Silas pushed it open, weapon raised. Rebecca sat at the table, pale but unharmed, Charlotte beside her. Across from them sat Reverend Abernathy, a Bible open before him. "Silas," Rebecca greeted, relief evident in her voice. "The Reverend rode out to check on us. He arrived just after you left." Abernathy stood, offering a reassuring smile. "Forgive the intrusion. I felt compelled to visit after our encounter in town." Silas holstered his weapon, tension easing slightly. "You made good time." "I took a shortcut," the older man explained. "Rebecca and I were just discussing Daniel. I've been filling in some gaps in her knowledge about her husband's past." Eleanor rushed to her mother's side, whispering something in her ear. Rebecca's expression darkened as she listened. "Fletcher threatened you?" she asked Silas. In his way, Silas confirmed, unloading their supplies. "Nothing we didn't expect." Abernathy cleared his throat. "Fletcher Hargrove is a troubled soul consumed by bitterness, but it's Mason who truly concerns me. He plays a longer game." "What do you know of this feud, Reverend?" Silas asked, taking a seat at the table. "You've been in redemption longer than anyone." The old man sighed heavily. "Too much, perhaps. I knew both your father and Mason's father, watched two good men destroy each other over pride and misunderstanding. He closed the Bible gently. What few know is that, before they were enemies, James Mitchell and Thomas Hargrove were the closest of friends. Partners even. Partners in what? Rebecca asked. Abernathy's eyes took on a distant look. During the war between the states, they served together in the Union Army. Afterward, they came west together seeking a fresh start. They found this valley and decided to settle it jointly, the east side for the Hargroves, the west for the Mitchells. What changed? Silas pressed, fascinated by this version of history he'd never heard. Gold, Abernathy said simply. They discovered a small deposit on the boundary between their properties, agreed to mine it together, and split the proceeds. His expression saddened. But greed has a way of poisoning even the purest hearts. Accusations flew of cheating, of stealing. The partnership dissolved in bitterness. And then my grandfather accused Thomas Hargrove of rustling cattle. Silas added, recalling the story he'd been told. Yes, though I've always wondered if that was merely a pretext for the real dispute. Abernathy shook his head. The confrontation that followed left both men dead, and their sons inherited not just the land, but the hatred. Rebecca leaned forward. Daniel believed there was more to the story. He said the gold was only part of it, that something else had been hidden, something both families sought for generations. Abernathy studied her intently. Did he say what it was? No, only that it could end the feud once and for all. Her voice faltered. He went to meet Fletcher the next day. I never saw him again. The Reverend's weathered hand covered hers briefly. I fear Daniel discovered something dangerous, a truth some would kill to keep buried. As darkness fell, Abernathy prepared to leave, promising to return in a few days. At the door he paused, turning to Silas. Be vigilant, son. The Hargroves won't stop until they get what they want. His eyes held a warning. And what they want may not be what you think. After the Reverend's departure, Silas reinforced the door and windows, checking his weapons one final time before settling into the chair by the fire. Rebecca tucked the girls into bed in the loft, then joined him, wincing slightly as she lowered herself into the second chair. Your brother made me a promise, she said quietly, staring into the flames, that our children would never know the hatred that poisoned both our families. He wanted to break the cycle. Yet, here we are, Silas observed grimly. Rebecca looked up, her eyes reflecting the firelight. It doesn't have to continue, Silas. Whatever Daniel found, whatever Fletcher killed him for, it could be the key to ending this once and for all. Or it could get us all killed, Silas countered. We're already marked for death, she said, voice steady. The only question is whether we face it on our terms or theirs. They sat in silence for a time, the crackling fire the only sound. Finally Silas spoke. Tomorrow we visit the hanging tree. If Daniel hid something there, we need to find it before the Hargroves do. Rebecca nodded, relief evident in her expression. Thank you, not just for this, but for everything. Taking us in, protecting us. I know it wasn't what you planned. Silas thought of the lonely years he'd spent in this cabin, walling himself off from human connection. Perhaps this unexpected responsibility was exactly what he needed a chance to protect, where he had once failed to save, where he had once lost. Get some rest, he said gently. Tomorrow will bring its own troubles. As Rebecca retreated to the bedroom, Silas remained by the fire, pulling out the small wooden box that contained Catherine's handkerchief and pendant. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. Daniel had entrusted Rebecca with a key a key that might fit the lock on Catherine's pendant. Tomorrow, they would seek answers at the hanging tree, and perhaps, finally, begin to unravel the mystery that had claimed his brother's life. Morning crept across Whisper Creek in tentative strokes of pink and gold, the distant mountains emerging from darkness like ships from fog. Silas stood on his porch, Winchester cradled in his arms, watching the land awaken. He'd slept little, his mind churning with questions about Daniel the Hargroves and whatever secret lay buried at the hanging tree. Inside the cabin, Rebecca prepared a simple breakfast while Eleanor helped Charlotte dress. The domestic sounds behind him, quiet voices, the clatter of plates, the crackle of the cook stove felt foreign after years of solitude, yet oddly comforting. "Beautiful morning," Rebecca said, joining him on the porch. She'd braided her hair, and though bruises still marked her face, her eyes were clear and determined. "Good day for answers," Silas replied, scanning the horizon one last time before turning to her. "Are you sure you're strong enough for this?" Rebecca straightened, wincing slightly at the movement. "I've been waiting 3 months to learn what happened to my husband. A few bruises won't stop me now." After breakfast, they set out for the hanging tree, Silas on foot, leading his horse with Rebecca riding and the girls walking alongside. Eleanor carried a small shovel Silas had found in the barn, while Charlotte clutched her latest drawing of the tree, occasionally consulting it as if it were a map. The hanging tree stood a mile east of the cabin, marking the boundary where Mitchell land met Hargrove territory. The ancient oak had witnessed generations of the feud, its gnarled branches reaching toward both properties, as if trying to bridge the divide. As they approached, Silas felt an instinctive unease. The tree had always seemed to possess a brooding presence, perhaps due to its grim history. 30 years ago, a cattle rustler had met his end beneath those branches strung up by a mob seeking frontier justice. Some claimed his spirit remained unable to cross the creek that separated the properties. "There it is," Silas said, gesturing to the massive oak looming ahead. "The hanging tree." Charlotte stopped abruptly, grabbing Eleanor's hand. Her eyes were wide fixed on the tree with obvious recognition. "It's all right," Eleanor assured her sister. "We're with Mr. Mitchell now. We're safe." Rebecca dismounted carefully, her gaze sweeping the surrounding area. "We should hurry. If the Hargroves are watching—" "They're always watching," Silas muttered, securing the horse to a nearby bush. "Eleanor, did your father indicate exactly where he was digging?" The girl nodded, leading them to the eastern side of the tree, where its massive roots emerged from the soil like ancient serpents. "Here." He dug between these 2 big roots. Silas knelt, examining the ground. Though months had passed, he could still detect subtle signs of disturbance. The soil was slightly looser, the grass sparser. Taking the shovel from Eleanor, he began to dig, careful not to damage the tree's roots. The earth yielded easily, suggesting it had been turned relatively recently. A foot down, the shovel struck something solid with a dull thud. "There's something here," Silas announced, digging more carefully now. Rebecca and the girls gathered close, watching intently, as Silas unearthed a small metal box, roughly the size of a cigar case. It was tarnished, but intact, sealed with a simple latch. "That's it," Eleanor whispered. "That's what Papa found." Silas brushed dirt from the box, noting the initials carved crudely into the lid, J.M. and T.H. James Mitchell and Thomas Hargrove, the patriarchs who had begun as friends before becoming bitter enemies. "Should we open it?" Rebecca asked, voice hushed. Silas nodded, releasing the latch. Inside lay 2 items, a folded piece of paper that appeared to be half of a map, similar to the fragment Rebecca had carried, and a yellowed envelope addressed simply to "Our Sons." "The other half of the map," Rebecca breathed, comparing it to the fragment they already possessed. When placed together, the pieces formed a complete map of the valley with several locations marked by strange symbols. Silas carefully opened the envelope, extracting a letter written in a firm, slanting hand. He recognized his father's handwriting immediately and began to read aloud, "To our sons, if you are reading this, then the worst has happened. Thomas and I have fallen victim to our own foolishness and pride. We pray that you, our sons, will be wiser than your fathers. What began as friendship ended in blood, not over gold, as most believe, but over a far greater treasure, the truth. The gold we found was merely a small part of a larger discovery, one that could change everything for both our families. We agreed to divide the map between us, each taking half, to ensure that neither family could claim the whole without the other's cooperation. It was our hope that one day, when tempers had cooled, our children might unite, where we could not, combining the halves to uncover what we lacked the courage to face. The full truth lies buried where it all began, at the place where 3 hills meet the rising sun. Trust no one with this secret, for many would kill to possess it. Remember this above all: the true wealth of a man lies not in what he owns, but in whom he loves. May you find the wisdom we lost. Your fathers, James Mitchell and Thomas Hargrove." Silence fell as Silas finished reading the words hanging in the air between them. Charlotte moved closer to Rebecca, seeking her mother's embrace, while Eleanor stared at the letter with wide eyes. "They wrote it together," Rebecca said finally. "Your father and Mason's father." Silas nodded, mind reeling. "Everything we thought we knew about the feud. It was built on a lie." "But what is this treasure they mention?" Rebecca asked. "What could be worth more than gold?" Before Silas could respond, the crack of a breaking twig alerted him to another presence. In one fluid motion, he drew his revolver and pushed Rebecca and the girls behind him. "Show yourself!" he called, scanning the surrounding trees. A figure emerged from the underbrush, Adam Hargrove Mason's youngest son. At 25, he lacked the hardened cruelty of his uncle Fletcher, his expression more uncertain than threatening. He held his hands away from his weapons, signaling peaceful intentions. "I'm alone," Adam said, stepping into the clearing. "No one knows I'm here." Silas kept his revolver trained on the young man. "What do you want, Hargrove?" Adam's gaze shifted to Rebecca, and the girls softening slightly. "To help if I can. Things have gone too far." "Why should we trust you?" Rebecca demanded, her arm tightening protectively around Charlotte. Adam sighed, removing his hat. "Because I was there the night Daniel disappeared. I heard what happened, and I can't live with it anymore." A tense silence followed this declaration. Silas studied the young man's face, searching for deceit, but finding only what appeared to be genuine remorse. "Tell us," he said, finally lowering his weapon slightly, but keeping it ready. Adam glanced nervously over his shoulder before speaking. "Uncle Fletcher killed him, shot him in the back when he tried to leave their meeting. Said Daniel had become a liability that he knew too much about." He hesitated. "About what?" Silas pressed. "About what really happened 30 years ago, the real reason our grandfathers died." Adam's voice dropped. "Fletcher's been obsessed with finding something he calls the true inheritance for years. He believed Daniel had discovered it." "And had he?" Rebecca asked, her voice tight with emotion. Adam gestured to the box in Silas's hands. "I reckon he found part of it. Whatever's in that box scared Fletcher badly enough to commit murder." Silas considered this information, trying to reconcile it with what they'd just discovered. "Why come to us now? Why risk crossing your family?" A flicker of shame crossed Adam's features. "I should have spoken up sooner. But Fletcher, he has a hold over my father, over all of us." He straightened, meeting Silas's gaze directly. I'm tired of living with this poison. Daniel was a good man. He didn't deserve what happened to him. Eleanor stepped forward suddenly. You were there. You saw Uncle Fletcher kill my father. Adam nodded, unable to meet her accusing stare. I'm sorry, Eleanor. I was a coward. Where is he buried? The girl demanded, tears streaming down her face. Where did you put him? By the North Creek, Adam replied softly. Under the willow grove. Fletcher made it look like an accident, that he'd fallen from his horse and broken his neck. But it wasn't true. Rebecca made a small broken sound, her composure finally cracking. Charlotte pressed against her side, silent tears tracking down her small face. Silas watched Adam carefully, still not entirely convinced of his sincerity. What does Fletcher know about this? He asked, indicating the box and map. He knows Daniel found something at the hanging tree. He's been searching for it, but hasn't located it yet. Adam's expression grew urgent. You need to be careful. Fletcher's gathering men, planning something big. I heard him telling my father they'd finish the Mitchell problem once and for all. When? Silas demanded. Soon. Tomorrow, maybe. Adam replaced his hat, backing away. I should go before I'm missed, but I'll try to warn you if I learn anything more. Why risk helping us? Rebecca asked. They're your family. Adam's face hardened. What they're doing isn't family. It's madness. His gaze swept over them all, lingering on the girls. Daniel wanted peace. Maybe it's time someone honored that wish. With that, he disappeared back into the trees, leaving them with more questions than answers and a newfound sense of urgency. We need to go, Silas said, gathering the map and letter. It's not safe here. As they hurried back toward the cabin, Rebecca rode in silence, her face a mask of grief, now that her worst fears about Daniel had been confirmed. Eleanor walked alongside Silas, her expression hardened by the knowledge of her father's murder. Do you believe him? She asked quietly. Adam. Silas considered the question. I think so, but it doesn't change our situation. If anything, it makes it more dangerous. Will you help us find Papa's body? Her voice was small, but determined. He should be properly buried. Yes, Silas promised, touched by her courage. When it's safe, we'll bring him home. Back at the cabin, they gathered around the table, piecing together the two halves of the map. The combined document showed the entire valley with several locations marked by strange symbols. One spot, where 3 hill-shaped peaks met, was circled and marked with an X. 3 Hills Point. Silas identified it. It's on the far edge of Hargrove Land, near the old mining claims. What could be buried there? Rebecca wondered. Whatever it is, both our grandfathers thought it important enough to hide and protect. Silas traced the route with his finger. It's at least a day's ride from here through Hargrove territory. We need to get there before Fletcher does, Rebecca insisted. If Daniel died for this secret, we owe it to him to uncover the truth. Silas shook his head. It's too dangerous. Fletcher's men will be watching the trails. And with what Adam told us about their plans, we can't just wait for them to come for us, Rebecca argued. This may be our only chance to understand what's really happening. Their debate was interrupted by Charlotte tugging at Silas's sleeve. She held up her rag doll, pointing insistently at its sewn belly. What is it, Charlotte? Silas asked, kneeling to her level. The child made a cutting motion, then pointed to the doll again. Eleanor watched, then understood. I think she wants you to open the doll, she explained. Curious, Silas gently took the worn toy. It felt heavier than it should with something solid inside. Using his pocket knife, he carefully cut a small slit in the seam, then reached inside. His fingers closed around a small object, a brass pocket watch. Opening it, he found not a clock face, but a small compartment containing a folded piece of paper. Daniel's watch, Rebecca breathed, recognizing it immediately. He always carried it. How did it get in Charlotte's doll? Eleanor looked at her sister with newfound respect. Charlotte must have hidden it. She saw something, didn't she? Charlotte nodded solemnly, then mimicked someone placing an object in the doll and putting a finger to her lips, a pantomime of secrecy. Silas unfolded the paper, a note written in a hasty scrawl. If you're reading this, I'm likely dead. Fletcher suspects I've found the map fragment. Meeting him tonight to negotiate, but don't trust his intentions. If something happens to me, take the girls and find Silas. The truth is bigger than our family's feud. It involves the whole valley. The key Rebecca wears opens more than just a locket. Trust no one but my brother, Daniel. Rebecca's hand went to the small key hanging around her neck. He knew, she whispered. He knew Fletcher might kill him. Silas reread the note, focusing on the cryptic reference to the key. He says it opens more than just a locket. What did he mean by that? A thought struck him. Reaching into his pocket, he withdrew the small wooden box containing Catherine's silver half-moon pendant. Maybe it's not just meant for this, he said, holding up the pendant with its tiny keyhole. Rebecca removed the key from her neck hands, trembling slightly as she fitted it into the pendant's lock. It slid in perfectly, turning with a faint click. The pendant's face sprang open, revealing not a compartment as Silas had expected, but a small, intricate mechanism like the inside of a compass, but with unfamiliar markings. It's not a locket, Silas realized. It's some kind of instrument. Eleanor leaned closer, studying the device. Look, there are symbols like the ones on the map. Indeed, around the edge of the circular mechanism were the same strange markings that adorned their newly completed map. It must be a key to decoding the map, Rebecca suggested. But how does it work? Before they could investigate further, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. Silas moved swiftly to the window, rifle ready. Sheriff Collins. He identified, spotting the lawman's distinctive gray horse. Collins rode alone, his expression grave as he dismounted before the cabin. Silas met him on the porch, keeping the door partially closed behind him. "Sheriff," he greeted cautiously, "what brings you out this way?" Collins removed his hat, running a hand through thinning hair. "Thought you should know Fletcher Hargrove's been gathering men in town. Hired guns, mostly, making no secret of his intentions, which are to reclaim his nieces and deal with anyone harboring them." Collins's mouth set in a grim line. "I told him the law doesn't support vigilante justice. He told me to mind my own business." Silas absorbed this information. "When, tomorrow at dawn, from what I hear." Collins replaced his hat. "I can't officially intervene without cause, Mitchell, but I thought you deserved warning." "I appreciate that," Silas said, genuinely surprised by the sheriff's gesture. "Why help us?" Collins sighed, looking suddenly older. "I've watched this feud poison redemption for too many years. Good people turned cruel by old hatreds." He glanced toward the cabin. "Those girls deserve better than to be pawns in Fletcher Hargrove's game." After the sheriff departed, Silas returned inside to find Rebecca already packing supplies. "You heard?" he asked. She nodded, her movements efficient despite her injuries. "We need to leave tonight. Get to Three Hills Point before Fletcher comes for us." "It's risky," Silas cautioned. "We'd be traveling through Hargrove territory in the dark with 2 children." "Staying is riskier," Rebecca countered. "At least this way we choose the battlefield." Eleanor approached Charlotte at her side. "We want to help Mr. Mitchell. We're not afraid." Looking at the determined faces before him, Silas realized he'd already made his decision. Whatever secret lay buried at Three Hills Point, it had cost his brother's life. He owed it to Daniel and to these girls who'd lost their father to uncover the truth. "We leave at nightfall," he agreed. "Pack only what's essential." The night closed around them like a protective cloak as they slipped away from the cabin. Silas led the way on foot, leading his horse with Rebecca and the girls riding. They traveled without lanterns, guided only by moonlight and Silas's intimate knowledge of the terrain. Their route skirted the main trails, following creek beds and wooded ravines where possible. It would take longer to reach Three Hills Point this way, but offered better chances of avoiding Hargrove patrols. Charlotte had fallen asleep against her mother's back, exhausted by the day's events. Eleanor remained alert, her small face set in an expression of determination beyond her years. "How much farther?" Rebecca asked quietly, as they paused to rest in a small grove of aspens. "Several hours," Silas replied, checking his pocket watch. It was just past midnight. "We should reach Three Hills Point by dawn if we keep this pace." Rebecca nodded, adjusting Charlotte's sleeping form. "Daniel used to speak of you, you know. Said you were the bravest person he'd ever known." Silas looked away, uncomfortable with the praise. "We were just boys then." "He regretted the distance between you, wanted to make it right." She studied his profile in the moonlight. "That's why he came back to Whisper Creek, I think. Not just for the map, but to reconnect with you." The thought sent a pang through Silas's chest. Another opportunity lost forever. "We were different people by then," he said softly. "Too much time had passed." "It's never too late for family," Rebecca responded. At least that's what Daniel believed. They continued their journey in companionable silence, winding through the landscape that had witnessed generations of Mitchell-Hargrove strife. Occasionally, Silas would halt, listening intently for any sound that might indicate pursuit, but the night remained quiet, save for the natural chorus of crickets and distant coyotes. As they crossed a shallow stream marking the boundary of Hargrove territory, Eleanor spoke up. "Mr. Mitchell, what do you think we'll find at Three Hills Point?" "I don't know," Silas answered honestly, "but whatever it is, both our grandfathers thought it important enough to hide from the world." "Do you think it's treasure?" the girl pressed. "Gold or jewels?" Daniel's note mentioned a truth that involves the whole valley, Rebecca reminded them. "That suggests something more significant than mere wealth." Silas nodded in agreement. "The most dangerous secrets are rarely about money." They pressed on the terrain, growing steeper as they approached the foothills. Three Hills Point lay ahead, a distinctive formation where three conical peaks rose from a rocky plateau, creating a natural landmark visible for miles. Dawn was breaking when they finally reached the base of the formation, the sky lightening from black to deep purple. They tethered the horse in a sheltered hollow, then proceeded on foot, consulting the map as they climbed. The X on their map corresponded to a spot between the three peaks, where a flat shelf of rock created a natural platform. As they reached it, Charlotte, now awake, pointed excitedly at a pile of stones arranged in a deliberate pattern, a cairn marking something significant. "This is it," Silas said, examining the stones. They were weathered, but clearly placed by human hands, forming a rough circle approximately 3 feet in diameter. Together, they began removing the stones, revealing a flat stone slab beneath. The slab bore the same strange symbols that adorned both the map and Catherine's pendant. In the center was a small circular indentation. The pendant, Rebecca realized, removing the silver half-moon from her pocket. "It fits here." She placed the pendant into the indentation. It settled perfectly, like a key in a lock. With trembling fingers, she inserted the small key into the pendant's mechanism and turned it. A series of soft clicks emanated from beneath the stone slab, followed by the sound of shifting earth. The slab itself began to move, sliding aside to reveal a narrow opening, a passageway leading underground. A hidden entrance, Silas breathed, amazed at the sophistication of the mechanism. Our grandfathers built this. But to what? Rebecca wondered. Silas lit a small lantern he'd brought, illuminating rough-hewn stone steps descending into darkness. Only one way to find out. He led the way, instructing Eleanor and Charlotte to stay close to Rebecca. The passage was narrow, but tall enough for an adult to walk upright, its walls reinforced with timber supports that spoke of careful construction. After descending perhaps 20 feet, the passage leveled out, opening into a larger chamber. Silas raised the lantern, its light revealing a sight none of them had expected. The chamber was roughly circular, its walls lined with shelves containing dozens of leather-bound books and stacks of yellowed documents. A large table occupied the center, covered with maps and what appeared to be surveying equipment. In one corner stood a printing press, small but serviceable, with trays of type nearby. "What is this place?" Eleanor whispered, her voice echoing slightly in the underground room. Silas approached the table, examining the documents spread across it. They were land deeds, hundreds of them, along with surveyor's notes and legal correspondence. It's an archive, he realized. A hidden repository of documents. Rebecca joined him, picking up one of the deeds. These are property records for the entire valley. She moved to the shelves, pulling down a leather-bound volume. And these appear to be journals. Opening one, she began to read aloud, April 15th, 1855. TH and I have completed our survey of the eastern section. The land is rich with ample water and good soil. We have mapped it carefully, dividing it into parcels suitable for homesteading. The railroad men came again today, offering a considerable sum for our silence. We declined, as always. She looked up, eyes wide. This is your grandfather's journal. He and Thomas Hargrove were surveying the valley together. Silas took the book, scanning further entries. Listen to this, July 3rd, 1855. The railroad's representative made veiled threats today, said if we proceeded with our plans to open the valley to independent settlers, we would regret it. TH suggested we secure our findings in a place where they cannot be destroyed or altered. We began construction of the hidden chamber today. They were fighting the railroad, Rebecca said, realization dawning. Not each other. Silas continued reading, turning pages rapidly. October 10th, 1855. Disaster has struck. The railroad men have spread rumors in town that TH and I are claim-jumping, filing false deeds. Some believe we're hoarding gold discoveries. Seeds of distrust are being sown between our families. The final entry was dated the day before James Mitchell and Thomas Hargrove had killed each other. May 24th, 1856. TH and I have decided to hide the evidence here, dividing the map between our families for safekeeping. We fear the railroad will not stop until they control the entire valley. If anything happens to us, we pray our sons will uncover the truth and finish what we started. The people of this valley deserve to know that their lands were honestly acquired, not stolen through the railroad's corrupt dealings. A heavy silence fell as Silas finished reading. Eleanor and Charlotte had moved to examine the printing press, while Rebecca stood motionless, absorbing the implications. The feud, she said finally. It was manufactured, created by the railroad to divide two men who stood in their way. And it worked, Silas added grimly. Our grandfathers died thinking the other had betrayed him. Our fathers continued the hatred, and the railroad got what it wanted: control of the valley's development. Until Daniel discovered the truth, Rebecca concluded. He found his half of the map, realized what it meant. "And Fletcher killed him for it," Eleanor said from across the room, her young voice hard with understanding. "Because the Hargroves have been working with the railroad all along." Silas looked at her sharply. "What makes you say that?" "These," Eleanor replied, holding up a stack of papers she'd found near the printing press. "They're receipts, payments from the Western Union Railroad to Fletcher Hargrove dating back years." Silas took the documents, scanning them quickly. "She's right. Fletcher's been on their payroll as a land acquisition specialist, whatever that means. And it means he's been helping them pressure small ranchers to sell," Rebecca said, disgust evident in her voice. "Using the Hargrove name and influence to serve the railroad's interests." "And Mason?" Silas wondered. "Is he involved too?" Before anyone could speculate further, the sound of voices drifted down from the entrance. Harsh, unfamiliar voices, followed by the scrape of boots on stone steps. "Someone's coming," Silas whispered, drawing his revolver. "Hide, now." Rebecca ushered the girls behind the printing press, while Silas extinguished the lantern and positioned himself beside the entrance to the chamber back, pressed against the wall. The voices grew clearer as their owners descended the passage. "Must be down here somewhere. Fletcher said not to return without the documents. I still don't understand what's so important about some old papers." "Don't need to understand. Just need to get paid." Two men entered the chamber, one carrying a lantern that cast long shadows across the room. They were strangers to Silas, likely the hired guns Sheriff Collins had mentioned. "Look at all this," the first man said, sweeping his lantern across the shelves. "Fletcher didn't say nothing about no library." "Just grab everything you can carry," the second man replied. "We'll let Fletcher sort it out." As they moved toward the table, Silas stepped from the shadow's revolver leveled at their backs. "Don't move," he ordered. Both men froze, then slowly raised their hands. "Turn around. Slowly." They complied, revealing weather-beaten faces with the hard eyes of men who killed for money. The taller one wore a gun belt with 2 revolvers, while his companion carried a shotgun currently slung across his back. "Mitchell, I presume?" the taller one said, a thin smile spreading across his face. "Fletcher said you might be here." "Drop your weapons," Silas commanded, keeping his revolver steady. "Now why would we do that?" the man replied, his smile widening. "When we've got you outnumbered." Before Silas could respond, the cold press of steel against the back of his neck made his blood run cold. "I'd listen to him, Mitchell," came Fletcher Hargrove's voice from behind. "Unless you want your brains decorating these old books." Silas had no choice but to lower his weapon. Fletcher stepped around him, revolver still trained on Silas's head. Unlike his hired men, Fletcher seemed unsurprised by the chamber's contents. "You've been a persistent problem, Mitchell, just like your brother." Fletcher gestured to one of his men. "Find the woman and children. They're in here somewhere. Leave them out of this," Silas growled. "They're innocent." Fletcher chuckled, the sound devoid of humor. "No one associated with the Mitchell name is innocent." His gaze traveled around the chamber. "I see you've discovered our grandfather's little secret. Convenient timing." We know everything," Silas said, stalling as he tried to think of a way out. "About the railroad, about your involvement, about how you killed Daniel." Something flickered in Fletcher's eyes, surprise, perhaps that Silas knew so much. "Daniel was a fool. He thought exposing old history would somehow matter." He shook his head. "The past is the past. It's the future that pays." "You betrayed your own family," Silas accused. "These records prove the Hargroves and Mitchells were partners, not enemies. The railroad created the feud to divide them." Fletcher shrugged. "And they paid well for the service," Still do. His expression hardened. Did you really think two backwoods surveyors could stand against the Western Union progress? Comes at a price, Mitchell. Some pay it, others profit from it. A commotion from behind the printing press announced the discovery of Rebecca and the girls. The second hired gun dragged them into the open, Rebecca struggling despite her injuries, while Charlotte clung to her skirts. Eleanor stood straight-backed and defiant, glaring at Fletcher with undisguised hatred. "Ah, the grieving widow and my dear nieces," Fletcher greeted them mockingly. "Family reunion complete." "You're no family of ours," Eleanor spat. "You killed our father." Fletcher's face darkened. "Your father was a traitor to the Hargrove name. He chose the wrong side." "The side of truth," Rebecca countered, chin raised, despite the gun pointed at her. "Daniel discovered what you'd been hiding, that the Mitchell-Hargrove feud was based on a lie, that you've been working for the people who murdered your own grandfather." "Times change," Fletcher replied dismissively. "The railroad offers opportunities my grandfather couldn't imagine." Mason understood that eventually. "Mason knows about this?" Silas asked, surprised. A smile played at the corners of Fletcher's mouth. "My brother knows what he needs to know. That the Mitchells are our enemies. That certain arrangements with the railroad benefit us all." "Does he know you killed Daniel?" Rebecca demanded. Fletcher's smile vanished. "Enough talking. We're leaving, and this place burns with everything in it." He addressed his men. "Tie them up. We'll take them back to Hargrove land, deal with them properly there." As one of the men moved to bind Silas's hands, a new voice rang out from the chamber entrance. "That's far enough, Fletcher." All heads turned to see Mason Hargrove standing at the passageway, revolver drawn. Behind him stood Sheriff Collins, and to Silas's surprise, Adam Hargrove. Fletcher's expression twisted with rage. "Mason, what are you doing here? Stopping you from making another mistake." The older Hargrove replied, his voice weary but resolute. "Adam told me everything. About Daniel. About the railroad." "Adam," Fletcher snarled, turning his fury on his nephew. "You treacherous—" "No more treachery," Mason cut him off, stepping fully into the chamber. "No more lies." His gaze traveled over the shelves of documents, recognition and sadness washing across his weathered features. "So it's true. All of it." Fletcher's composure slipped, panic edging into his voice. "Whatever Adam told you, he's twisting the truth. The railroad deals were beneficial to all of us. The Mitchells were the enemies, always have been." "Were they?" Mason asked softly, picking up the journal Silas had been reading. "Or was that just another lie you fed me, brother, like the lie about Daniel running off and abandoning his family?" Fletcher's men looked uncertainly between the Hargrove brothers, weapons lowered slightly in confusion. Sheriff Collins used the distraction to move closer to Rebecca and the girls, positioning himself protectively. "You don't understand what's at stake," Fletcher insisted, desperation creeping into his tone. "The railroad's plans for the valley, the money to be made—" "Money," Mason interrupted, voice hardening. "You killed our nephew for money." He shook his head in disgust. "Our father died believing James Mitchell had betrayed him. I've spent my life hating the Mitchells because of it. And all this time," he gestured to the chamber around them, "all this time, they were partners trying to protect the valley from men like you." Fletcher's face contorted with rage. "Don't be a fool, Mason. The railroad can't be stopped. They'll have this land one way or another." "Not if these records become public," Silas interjected. "The deeds, the surveys, the proof of the railroad's manipulation. It would invalidate every corrupt land deal they've made." Fletcher's eyes darted around the room, calculating. Suddenly he lunged toward Charlotte, grabbing the child and pressing his revolver to her temple. "Nobody moves!" he shouted, as Rebecca screamed in horror. "I'm walking out of here, and the girl comes with me. Anyone tries to stop me, she dies." Charlotte stood rigid with terror, her small face pale as marble. Eleanor moved instinctively toward her sister, but Adam held her back. "Fletcher, don't do this," Mason pleaded, lowering his weapon. "She's just a child, your brother's child." "She's leverage," Fletcher replied coldly, backing toward the entrance with Charlotte held firmly against him. "Once I'm clear, you can have her back, provided these documents never see the light of day." Silas watched in helpless fury as Fletcher retreated, dragging Charlotte with him. The hired guns, sensing the tide turning, began edging toward the exit as well. In the tense silence, a small sound drew Silas's attention, a faint whimper from Charlotte. The child's eyes, wide with fear, met his. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. Without warning, Charlotte went limp, dropping her full weight suddenly. The unexpected movement caused Fletcher to loosen his grip momentarily. It was all the opening Silas needed. He lunged forward, tackling Fletcher around the waist. The revolver discharged the bullet, embedding harmlessly in the ceiling as both men crashed to the ground. Charlotte scrambled away, running into her mother's arms. Sheriff Collins and Adam moved swiftly to restrain the hired guns, while Mason covered Fletcher with his revolver. Silas pinned the struggling man to the ground, rage coursing through him as he thought of Daniel, of the years of hatred based on lies. "Give me one reason not to kill you right now," he growled, hands tightening around Fletcher's throat. "Silas, don't," Rebecca called. "He's not worth it." Fletcher's eyes bulged as he clawed at Silas's grip. "The railroad," he gasped. "They'll still win." "Not this time," Sheriff Collins said, producing a pair of handcuffs. "Fletcher Hargrove, you're under arrest for the murder of Daniel Mitchell, attempted kidnapping, and a whole list of other charges I'll enjoy writing up." Silas released his hold, stepping back, as Collins secured the cuffs around Fletcher's wrists. The fight seemed to drain out of Fletcher as the reality of his situation sank in. Mason approached Silas, expression grave. "I owe you an apology, Mitchell. It seems our families have been divided by lies for too long." Silas studied the older man, seeing genuine remorse in his eyes. "It wasn't your fault. We were all deceived." "Nevertheless," Mason continued, "blood was spilled that can't be restored. Your brother—" He trailed off, unable to finish. "Daniel wanted peace between our families," Rebecca said, joining them with the girls at her side. "He believed the truth could heal old wounds." Mason nodded solemnly. "Perhaps it's not too late to honor that wish." As Sheriff Collins led Fletcher and his men up the passage, Silas turned his attention to the chamber's contents. "These records need to be protected. They're the evidence we need to challenge the railroad's hold on the valley." "We'll need to move quickly," Adam advised. "Once the railroad learns Fletcher has been arrested, they'll send others." "Then we'd better get started," Silas replied, gathering the most critical documents. "First we make copies. Then we spread the truth to every homesteader, every rancher in the valley." Rebecca picked up the journal, clutching it like a precious relic. "Daniel would be proud," she said softly. "This is what he died, for the chance to right an old wrong." As they prepared to leave the hidden chamber, Charlotte suddenly broke away from her mother, running to Silas and throwing her arms around his waist. He froze, surprised by the gesture, then gently returned the embrace. "Thank you," the child whispered, her first words since they'd met. "For finding the truth." Silas felt a knot in his throat as he looked down at her. "Thank you for being brave," he replied. "Your pa would be proud of you. Of both of you," he added, including Eleanor in his gaze. Outside, the morning sun had fully risen, bathing Three Hills Point in golden light. The world seemed somehow clearer, as if a fog had lifted. Mason and Adam prepared to ride ahead to Redemption with the prisoners, while Silas helped Rebecca and the girls gather their belongings. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked, as they mounted up for the journey back. Silas considered the question, looking out over the valley that had been shaped by decades of conflict based on a lie. "Now we rebuild," he said simply, "starting with the truth." Rebecca's eyes met his, a silent understanding passing between them. Whatever came next, they would face it together, not as Mitchells or Hargroves, but as family. As they rode away from Three Hills Point, Silas felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Daniel's last wish might yet be fulfilled. The feud that had claimed so many lives could finally end, replaced by the partnership their grandfathers had originally intended. The road ahead would not be easy. The railroad would fight back, using every resource at their disposal to maintain control. But with the truth on their side and unexpected allies in Mason and Adam Hargrove, they stood a fighting chance. For the first time since Catherine's death, Silas found himself thinking of the future rather than the past. A future where Eleanor and Charlotte could grow up without the burden of hatred. A future where old wounds might finally begin to heal. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but as they crested the hill overlooking Whisper Creek, Silas realized it might be the life he needed, one with purpose, connection, and perhaps even redemption. The journey back to Redemption was made in contemplative silence, each rider lost in their own thoughts. Silas led the way, saddlebags heavy with the most crucial documents from the hidden chamber. Rebecca followed with Charlotte, seated before her, while Eleanor rode with Adam Hargrove, the young man's contrition evident in his gentle handling of Daniel's daughter. Mason and Sheriff Collins had gone ahead with Fletcher and his hired men, ensuring the prisoners reached the town jail without incident. The distance between Three Hills Point and Redemption was not great as the crow flies, but the terrain demanded careful navigation, particularly with their precious cargo. "Will people believe us?" Eleanor asked suddenly, breaking the silence as they traversed a shallow creek. "About the railroad and the feud being a lie." Adam glanced down at the girl, then toward Silas. "Some will resist. The railroad has powerful friends. But truth has a way of making itself heard, especially when there's proof. Your grandfather's journal alone is compelling evidence," Rebecca added. "Combined with the land deeds and Fletcher's payment records." "It won't be easy," Silas cautioned, ever the realist. "Men like Fletcher don't work alone. The railroad will have other agents, other means of maintaining control." "Then we'll face them too," Eleanor declared with the absolute certainty of youth. "For Papa." Silas couldn't help but smile at her determination. Daniel's daughters had inherited his spirit, if not his caution. As they approached the outskirts of Redemption, signs of unusual activity became apparent. Riders moved along the distant roads, and smoke rose from more chimneys than typical for midday. The town seemed agitated like a disturbed anthill. "Something's wrong," Silas murmured, reining in his horse on a ridge overlooking the settlement. "There are too many people about." Adam shaded his eyes, scanning the town below. "Those aren't local men," he observed. "Strangers, and armed by the look of them." Rebecca drew closer, concern etching her features. "The railroad." "Most likely," Silas agreed grimly. "News travels fast. They must have learned of Fletcher's arrest." "What will we do?" Eleanor asked, her earlier bravado giving way to apprehension. Silas considered their options. Entering redemption openly would be dangerous, particularly with the documents they carried. Yet, they needed to reach Sheriff Collins and Mason to consolidate their evidence and plan their next steps. "We circle around," he decided. "Approach from the east, where the trees provide cover. Adam, you know a back way into town." The young Hargrove nodded. "Through the old creek bed. It runs behind the livery stable." "Good. That's our path." Silas turned to Rebecca. "Keep the girls close. If anything happens, your priority is their safety. Get them to Reverend Abernathy's church. It's neutral ground." Rebecca nodded her arm, tightening protectively around Charlotte. "And you, I'll make sure these documents reach the right hands." His expression softened slightly. "We've come too far to fail now." They proceeded cautiously, abandoning the main trail for the denser coverage of the pine forest that bordered Redemption's eastern edge. Adam led them through a dried creek bed, its banks high enough to shield them from view as they approached the rear of the livery stable. The stable owner, an aging man named Cyrus, who had always maintained neutrality in the Mitchell-Hargrove disputes, greeted them with surprise, but asked no questions as they stabled their horses. "Town's full of strangers," he informed them in a hushed voice. "Railroad men, they're saying, armed and looking for trouble." "Sheriff Collins," Silas inquired. "At the jail with your prisoners." "Place is surrounded, though. They're demanding Fletcher's release." Silas exchanged concerned glances with Adam. "And Mason Hargrove. Last I heard he was at the jail too, standing with the sheriff, surprisingly enough." Cyrus shook his head in wonderment. "Never thought I'd see the day a Hargrove and a Mitchell would be on the same side." "Times change," Adam replied, helping Eleanor down from his horse. "We need to reach them without being seen." Cyrus scratched his grizzled chin thoughtfully. "There's a way. Old tunnel runs from this stable to the general store cellar. Dug it during the Troubles back in '67 when supplies were scarce. Few people know about it now." Silas clapped the old man on the shoulder. "Cyrus, you're a godsend." The stable owner led them to a trapdoor hidden beneath hay bales in an empty stall. Beneath it, a narrow passage led into darkness, shored up with timber supports that had seen better days. "It'll be tight, but it'll get you there," Cyrus assured them. "The exit is behind the flour barrels in Sullivan's storeroom. She knows about it. Her father helped dig it." Silas thanked him again, then turned to the others. "Rebecca, you and the girls go first. Adam and I will follow, make sure we're not tracked." Rebecca hesitated, clearly reluctant to separate. "Be careful," she said, finally gathering her skirts to descend the rough-hewn steps. "Always," Silas promised, helping Eleanor and Charlotte into the passage after their mother. Once they had disappeared into the darkness, Adam turned to Silas. "The railroad won't stop with Fletcher. They've invested too much in controlling this valley." "I know," Silas replied, checking his revolver before returning it to its holster. "But neither will we." The tunnel was as cramped as Cyrus had warned, barely tall enough to stand upright, with rough earthen walls occasionally supported by wooden beams. They proceeded by the light of a small lantern Cyrus had provided, their shadows dancing grotesquely against the walls. Charlotte clung to Rebecca's hand, while Eleanor walked proudly beside Silas, occasionally casting worried glances at the low ceiling. The air was stale, but breathable, carrying the earthy scent of damp soil and aged wood. "How much further?" Rebecca whispered after they had walked for several minutes. "Can't be far," Silas reassured her. "Redemption isn't that large." True to his word, they soon reached the end of the tunnel, a vertical shaft, with a wooden ladder leading up to another trapdoor. Silas climbed first, pushing gently against the door and listening for any sounds from above. Hearing nothing, he eased it open, finding himself amid barrels of flour in Sullivan's storeroom just as Cyrus had described. One by one, they emerged from the tunnel, dusting themselves off in the dim light, filtering through a small window. The storeroom was mercifully empty, allowing them a moment to gather their bearings. "We need to split up," Silas decided, removing several documents from his saddlebag. "Adam, take these to the church. Find Reverend Abernathy, show him what we've discovered. He has influence with the townspeople." Adam accepted the papers with a solemn nod. "What about you?" "I'm going to the jail. Sheriff Collins needs to know what we're facing." Silas turned to Rebecca. "Take the girls to the church as well. It's the safest place for now." Rebecca's expression hardened with resolve. "No, Charlotte will go with Adam, but Eleanor and I are coming with you. Daniel was my husband, and this fight is as much mine as yours." Silas recognized the determination in her eyes, the same look Daniel had worn when his mind was set. Arguing would only waste precious time. "Stay close," he conceded. "And if I say run, you run. No questions." They parted ways at the store's back door, Adam taking Charlotte toward the church, while Silas led Rebecca and Eleanor through back alleys toward the jail. The streets of Redemption seemed unnaturally tense, with few locals visible. Those who were abroad moved quickly, eyes downcast, hurrying to complete their business and return to safety. The jail stood at the far end of Main Street, a solid stone building with barred windows and a heavy oak door. As Cyrus had warned, it was surrounded by strangers, hard-eyed men in dark suits and dusters, their stance and bearing marking them as professional gunmen rather than ordinary citizens. "Railroad men," Silas murmured, observing from the shadow of an alleyway. "At least a dozen of them." Through the jail's front window, they could see Sheriff Collins standing firm, arms crossed. Mason Hargrove stood beside him, his silver hair unmistakable even at this distance. The silhouette of another man was visible as well, tall and well-dressed, gesturing emphatically as he spoke to the sheriff. "Who's that?" Eleanor whispered, peering around Silas. "Must be the railroad representative," Rebecca surmised. "Their negotiator. Looks more like he's making demands than negotiating," Silas observed grimly. A back entrance to the jail existed, a reinforced door used for discreetly transferring prisoners. If they could reach it unseen, they might gain entry without confronting the railroad men directly. "This way," Silas directed, leading them deeper into the alley and around toward the rear of the building. The back entrance was unguarded, an oversight Silas attributed to the railroad men's urban sensibilities. In cities, controlling the front might be sufficient. In frontier towns like Redemption, every door mattered. Silas knocked softly, 3 short raps, followed by 2 longer ones, an old signal he and Collins had used years ago during a cattle-rustling investigation. For a moment, nothing happened. Then came the sound of a bolt being drawn back, and the door opened a crack. Deputy Wilson, a young man barely out of his teens, peered out suspiciously. Recognition dawned when he saw Silas. "Mr. Mitchell," he whispered, opening the door wider. "Sheriff said you might come. Hurry inside." They slipped in quickly, finding themselves in a narrow corridor lined with cells. Fletcher Hargrove occupied the furthest one, his expression darkening when he spotted them. His hired guns were confined in adjacent cells, subdued and sullen. Sheriff Collins emerged from his office at the front of the building, relief evident in his weathered features. "Mitchell, glad you made it. Situation's deteriorating." "So, I see," Silas replied, nodding toward the window where the railroad men remained visible. "Their negotiator making trouble." "That's James Hollister, Western Union's regional director," Collins explained. "Arrived an hour ago with his security detail, demanding Fletcher's immediate release, claiming jurisdictional authority." His mustache twitched with distaste. "Offered me a year's salary to look the other way." "And," Silas prompted. Collins snorted. "Told him I wasn't for sale. Mason backed me up surprisingly enough. As if summoned by his name, Mason Hargrove appeared from the office, his expression grave but resolute. He nodded to Silas, then his gaze fell on Rebecca and Eleanor. "Mrs. Mitchell." He acknowledged a flicker of shame crossing his features. "I owe you an apology that can never be adequate. What Fletcher did to Daniel, to you and the girls." He trailed off, words failing him. Rebecca regarded him steadily. "You were deceived, Mr. Hargrove. We all were." "Not an excuse," Mason replied, "but perhaps a starting point for amends." He knelt to Eleanor's eye level. "Your father was a good man. Better than I ever gave him credit for. I'm sorry I didn't see that sooner." Eleanor studied him with solemn eyes before nodding once. Not forgiveness, perhaps, but acknowledgement. Silas removed the remaining documents from his saddlebag, spreading them on Collins's desk. "We found everything, Sheriff. Land deed survey maps, Fletcher's payment records, and our grandfather's journal, explaining how the railroad manufactured the feud." Collins whistled softly as he examined the papers. "This is Dynamite Mitchell, proof of corruption stretching back decades." "Enough to challenge the railroad's land claims?" Mason asked. "Enough to blow their entire operation wide open," Collins confirmed. "These deeds show the original surveys and grants, proving the railroad's subsequent claims were fraudulent." A commotion from outside interrupted their discussion, raised voices followed by the ominous click of weapons being readied. "Time's up, Collins," Hollister's voice carried clearly through the window. "Send Fletcher Hargrove out now, or we're coming in." The sheriff moved to the front door, hand resting on his revolver. "This is still my jurisdiction, Hollister. Your men have no authority here." "I have documents stating otherwise," the railroad director replied smoothly. "Signed by the territorial governor himself. Fletcher Hargrove is a Western Union employee with diplomatic immunity from local prosecution." Collins turned to Silas, his expression grim. "Forged papers, no doubt, but it'll take weeks to prove it. By then, Fletcher will be long gone." "We can't let that happen," Silas insisted. "Daniel deserves justice." Mason stepped forward. "Let me talk to Hollister. He knows me, thinks I'm still aligned with the railroad's interests." "And say what?" Collins asked skeptically. "That I'm releasing Fletcher into my custody. Family matter." Mason's eyes hardened. "It'll get Hollister and his men to stand down temporarily. Buy us time to organize the evidence." Silas exchanged glances with Collins, considering the strategy. It was risky, but might work. Hollister had no reason to suspect Mason had changed sides. "Do it," Silas decided. "But we'll need a bigger plan. The documents alone won't be enough if the railroad has the governor in their pocket." Rebecca, who had been examining the papers, looked up suddenly. "The printing press," she said, "in the hidden chamber. Our grandfathers built it to spread the truth if necessary." "But it's miles away," Collins objected. "And we'd need someone who knows how to operate it." Eleanor stepped forward, her small face alight with purpose. "Papa taught me. He was showing me how to set type before—" She swallowed hard. "I can do it." Silas stared at her in amazement. "Daniel taught you printing." The girl nodded proudly. "He said knowledge is power, and the written word is the strongest weapon of all." A plan began to form in Silas's mind, audacious, perhaps even foolhardy, but with potential. "If we could print these findings, distribute them throughout the valley, the people would know they've been lied to," Rebecca finished, understanding dawning. "That their land claims are legitimate, not subject to the railroad's right-of-way claims." "Hollister would be ruined," Mason added, "his entire operation exposed." Collins rubbed his mustache thoughtfully. Bold move, Mitchell. But how do we get back to Three Hills Point with Hollister's men watching every road? We don't, Silas replied. We bring the press here. For the next hour, they developed their strategy in hushed tones, aware of Fletcher's presence in his cell and the railroad men still besieging the jail. Mason would negotiate with Hollister, pretending to take Fletcher into his custody. This would disperse the immediate threat, while giving them time to implement the larger plan. Adam would lead a small team to retrieve the printing press from Three Hills Point, bringing it to Reverend Abernathy's church neutral ground, where they could set up operations. Meanwhile, Silas, Rebecca, and Collins would organize the evidence and prepare a clear, compelling narrative of the railroad's deception. "What about the other Hargrove men?" Collins asked Mason. "Where will they stand?" Mason's expression turned contemplative. "Many will follow me once they learn the truth, the younger ones especially. They've never understood the feud, only obeyed out of family loyalty." "And the older ones?" Silas pressed. "Some are too set in their ways," Mason admitted, "but they respect the law, if not the Mitchells. If Sheriff Collins stands with us, they'll at least stay neutral." With their plan established, Mason prepared to confront Hollister. Before leaving, he turned to Silas, extending his hand. "My brother betrayed everything our family once stood for," he said gravely. "I aim to restore the Hargrove name if you'll give me that chance." Silas hesitated only briefly before clasping Mason's hand. "Our grandfathers were partners before they were enemies. Perhaps we can be again." As Mason departed to engage Hollister, Rebecca moved to Silas's side. "Do you trust him?" she asked quietly. "Not entirely," Silas admitted, "but I believe he was genuinely shocked by Fletcher's actions, and we need allies." Through the window, they watched Mason address Hollister and his men. The railroad director appeared skeptical at first, but eventually nodded in agreement. The gunmen relaxed their stance, some holstering their weapons. "It's working," Collins observed. "Now we need to move quickly. Deputy Wilson will escort you to the church through the back streets. I'll remain here to maintain appearances." Silas gathered the most crucial documents, leaving duplicates with Collins for safekeeping. "Be careful, Sheriff. Hollister won't be fooled for long." "I've dealt with corporate bullies before," Collins replied with a wry smile. "Just get that press running. We'll need the truth in print before Hollister realizes what we're doing." Deputy Wilson led them through Redemption's quieter back streets, avoiding the main street where Hollister's men still lingered. The church stood on a small hill at the edge of town, a simple white-painted structure with a modest steeple surrounded by ancient oaks that provided welcome cover. Inside, they found Adam and Charlotte, with Reverend Abernathy, who had already cleared the church basement for their use. Several young men from town were present as well, volunteered by the Reverend to assist with retrieving the printing press. "These boys know the back country better than anyone," Abernathy explained. "They can have your press here by midnight if they leave now." Adam prepared to lead the expedition, furnished with detailed directions to Three Hills Point and the hidden chamber. Charlotte clung to him briefly before he departed, the child having developed an unexpected bond with the young Hargrove who had helped save her. "I'll return soon," he promised her. "Keep your sister out of trouble." As Adam and his team departed, Silas turned his attention to organizing their evidence. The basement of the church became their war room, with tables cleared for document sorting and walls adorned with maps of the valley showing the disputed territories. Eleanor proved invaluable, her remarkable memory for details helping them arrange the complex narrative in a comprehensible order. Charlotte, too, contributed in her quiet way, sorting papers and bringing refreshments provided by the Reverend's housekeeper. "Your daughters are remarkable," Silas told Rebecca as they worked side by side into the evening. "Daniel would be proud." Rebecca smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since their fateful meeting at the abandoned station. "They are the best of him," she agreed. "His courage, his intelligence, his determination to do what's right, regardless of the cost." "They have their mother's strength as well," Silas observed. "Few women would have endured what you have without breaking." A faint blush colored Rebecca's cheeks. "When you have children, you find strength you never knew you possessed." Their eyes met briefly, an unspoken understanding passing between them. In the midst of danger and upheaval, something else was growing, a connection born of shared purpose and mutual respect, perhaps even the first tentative roots of affection. The moment was interrupted by Eleanor's excited call. "Mr. Mitchell, I found something important." The girl held up a document she'd discovered tucked within the pages of James Mitchell's journal. A letter from the territorial governor dated 1855, acknowledging the Mitchell-Hargrove Land Survey as the official record for the Whisper Creek Valley. "This is official recognition," Silas realized, examining the document. "Proof that our grandfather's survey was legally binding before the railroad began their manipulations." "The cornerstone of our case," Rebecca agreed. "With this, we can prove the railroad's subsequent claims were fraudulent." As night fell, Reverend Abernathy brought news from town. Mason had successfully convinced Hollister to withdraw his men to the hotel under the pretense that Fletcher was being held at the Hargrove Ranch pending family discussions. "Hollister's "We're suspicious, though," the Reverend reported. "He sent telegrams east. Whatever you're planning, it needs to happen soon." Shortly after midnight, Adam returned with the printing press disassembled for transport and carried in pieces by his team of volunteers. The church basement transformed into a makeshift print shop as they reassembled the machine under Eleanor's surprisingly knowledgeable direction. "Papa and I practiced on a press just like this," she explained as she showed them how to set the type. "He said printing was magic, turning thoughts into something people could hold in their hands." By dawn, they had produced the first copies of The Whisper Creek Truth, a 4-page broadsheet detailing the railroad's decades of deception, complete with reproductions of key documents and a clear explanation of how the Mitchell-Hargrove feud had been manufactured to serve corporate interests. Silas held the first copy, the fresh ink still fragrant. "This changes everything," he said quietly. "Once people read this, the railroad's control over the valley ends," Rebecca finished. "Land they've claimed through intimidation and fraud will revert to its rightful owners. If we can distribute it widely enough, quickly enough," Adam cautioned, "Hollister won't sit idle once he realizes what we're doing." Reverend Abernathy had already organized distribution teams, trusted locals, who would carry copies to every homestead ranch and mining camp in the valley. Adam would lead a group to the Hargrove Ranch, ensuring Mason had ammunition for his confrontation with Hollister. "What about Fletcher?" Silas asked, suddenly remembering the architect of so much suffering. "He's still in Collins's jail, but once Hollister discovers Mason's deception, I'll send men to reinforce the sheriff," Adam promised. "Fletcher must face justice for Daniel's murder regardless of what happens with the railroad." As dawn broke over, redemption riders departed in all directions, each carrying bundles of the freshly printed broadsheet. Silas watched from the church steps, aware they had crossed a point of no return. The truth was unleashed, for better or worse, the long deception would end today. Rebecca joined him, Charlotte and Eleanor at her side. "What now?" she asked softly. "Now we face Hollister directly," Silas replied. At the town hall, Masons arranged a meeting ostensibly to discuss terms for Fletcher's release. "It's a trap," Rebecca realized. "For Hollister." Silas nodded grimly. "He'll come expecting to negotiate from a position of power. Instead, he'll find himself facing the very evidence that destroys his operation." "He'll be dangerous," Rebecca cautioned, glancing at her daughters. Men like that don't surrender power willingly. Which is why the girls stay here with Reverend Abernathy, Silas insisted. This confrontation is for those who can defend themselves if necessary. Eleanor immediately protested. But Papa would want us there. It's our fight, too. Your father would want you safe, Silas countered gently. Honor him by living to see what his sacrifice accomplishes. Though clearly unhappy, Eleanor reluctantly agreed, hugging her mother fiercely before allowing Reverend Abernathy to lead her and Charlotte to the safety of his office. Silas and Rebecca made their way to the town hall, a modest building at the center of Redemption that served for everything from civic meetings to harvest dances. Already townsfolk were gathering, drawn by Mason's public announcement of an important meeting regarding the future of Whisper Creek Valley. Inside, Mason and Sheriff Collins had arranged chairs in a rough semicircle with a table at the front bearing copies of their evidence. Adam arrived shortly after Silas and Rebecca, reporting that distribution of the broadsheet was proceeding smoothly, with copies already reaching outlying homesteads. "Hargrove men are with us," he added in a low voice. Once they read the truth, most chose to stand with Father rather than the railroad. As the hall filled, tension mounted. Local ranchers and shopkeepers took seats, many clutching copies of The Whisper Creek Truth and discussing its revelations in hushed, incredulous tones. The mood was a volatile mixture of anger, confusion, and determination. At precisely 10 o'clock, James Hollister entered, flanked by 4 of his remaining gunmen. The railroad director was a study in calculated composure, tall and impeccably dressed with cold eyes that betrayed no emotion as he surveyed the assembled crowd. "Mason," he greeted, ignoring the others. "I understood this was to be a private negotiation regarding your brother." Mason rose, his weathered face solemn. "I'm afraid I misled you, Hollister. This meeting concerns something far more significant than Fletcher's fate." Hollister's gaze darted to the table of documents, then to the broadsheets many attendees held. A flicker of unease crossed his features before his mask of confidence returned. "Whatever game you're playing, Hargrove, it won't end well. The Western Union Railroad has contracts, government backing, built on lies and forgery," Sheriff Collins interrupted, stepping forward. "We have proof, Hollister. Decades of your company's corruption laid bare for all to see." Hollister's composed facade slipped further as he noted the unified front before him, Mitchell and Hargrove standing together, the sheriff beside them, and the townspeople clearly aligned against him. "These allegations are baseless," he blustered, though with diminishing conviction. "The railroad's claims in this valley are legally established." "No," Silas countered, raising his voice to address the entire gathering. "The legal claim to this valley was established by James Mitchell and Thomas Hargrove in 1855, recognized by the territorial governor and recorded in documents your company tried to bury." He held up the governor's letter, then passed it around for inspection. "The Mitchell-Hargrove survey is the only legitimate land division in Whisper Creek. Everything that followed, every deed the railroad claims, is fraudulent." A murmur rippled through the crowd as the significance sank in. Homesteaders who had been pressured to sell ranchers who had lost grazing rights to right-of-way claims all began to realize the implications. Hollister's composure cracked entirely. "This changes nothing. The railroad has the resources, the political connections to what?" Mason demanded. "Continue deceiving honest people, murder those who discover your schemes as you did my nephew." His voice rose in righteous anger. "Daniel Mitchell died because he found the truth you tried to bury. How many others have suffered for your company's greed?" The crowd's murmurs grew louder, more indignant. Hollister glanced nervously at his gunmen, who shifted uneasily, outnumbered and increasingly aware of the hostile atmosphere. Rebecca stepped forward, her presence commanding immediate attention. "My husband believed the people of this valley deserved to know how they'd been manipulated," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "He died for that belief, but his sacrifice won't be in vain." She gestured to the broadsheets. "The truth is out, Mr. Hollister, not just in this room, but across the entire valley. By nightfall, every settler, every rancher will know how the Western Union Railroad created the Mitchell-Hargrove feud to divide and conquer this land." Hollister's face flushed with anger. "You think some homemade newspaper will stand against the Western Union? We have lawyers, judges, politicians, who won't risk their reputations once this story reaches Denver." Sheriff Collins interjected. "Copies are already on their way to the territorial capital and beyond. The governor himself will have some explaining to do about certain documents bearing his forged signature." For the first time, genuine fear flickered in Hollister's eyes. His gaze darted around the room, seeking any ally, finding none. "This isn't over," he threatened, backing toward the door. "The railroad doesn't surrender valuable assets without a fight." "Neither do we," Silas replied evenly. "The people of Whisper Creek have been fighting your kind of corruption for generations. The difference is now we're fighting together." As if to emphasize his point, Mason Hargrove moved to stand beside him, the symbolism not lost on anyone present. The oldest son of Thomas Hargrove and the last surviving son of James Mitchell united against their common enemy. Hollister departed with as much dignity as he could muster, his gunmen following close behind. The moment the door closed, a cheer erupted from the assembled townspeople, a release of tension and a celebration of long-overdue justice. In the days that followed, the ripple effects of their revelation spread throughout the territory. The Western Union Railroad, facing public scrutiny and potential legal challenges, hastily withdrew its most controversial claims in Whisper Creek Valley. Homesteaders, whose land had been seized through questionable means, found their deeds restored, while ranchers regained access to water sources the railroad had appropriated. Fletcher Hargrove faced trial for Daniel's murder, with Adam providing key testimony. The evidence was overwhelming, and even Fletcher's expensive lawyers couldn't prevent a guilty verdict. He was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison, effectively ending his influence over the valley's affairs. Mason Hargrove, true to his word, worked to rebuild the family's reputation on more honorable foundations. He publicly acknowledged the Mitchell-Hargrove partnership that had founded the settlement and initiated efforts to memorialize both patriarchs at Three Hills Point. 1 week after Hollister's departure, Silas stood at Daniel's grave in the small cemetery behind Reverend Abernathy's church. The marker was simple but dignified, carved from local stone, and bearing the words, "Daniel Mitchell, beloved husband, father, and seeker of truth." Rebecca and the girls had already paid their respects, leaving wildflowers gathered from the meadow near the hanging tree. Now Silas stood alone, reconciling with the brother he had lost twice, once to distance, and finally to death. "You were right, Daniel," he said softly to the quiet air, "about everything. The feud, the railroad, the need for truth." He paused, emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me, but I promise you this, I'll be there for them now." As he spoke, he sensed rather than heard someone approach. Turning, he found Rebecca standing a respectful distance away, her expression gentle. "Sorry to interrupt," she said. "The girls are asking for you. We're preparing to leave for the cabin." In the aftermath of Fletcher's trial, Rebecca had accepted Silas's invitation to remain at the Mitchell property, at least temporarily. The Hargrove Ranch held too many painful memories, and her own small homestead had been neglected during her captivity and recovery. I wasn't interrupting anything important, was I? She asked as they walked back toward the church. Silas shook his head. Just making peace. Something long overdue. Rebecca nodded in understanding. Daniel always hoped you two would reconcile someday. He kept your letters, you know, all three of them. Read them so often the paper grew thin. The revelation struck Silas deeply. I thought he'd forgotten about me, about this place. Never, Rebecca assured him. You were always his hero, even when you were apart. At the church, they found Eleanor and Charlotte helping Adam load the last of their belongings onto a wagon. The girls had formed an unlikely bond, with the young Hargrove perhaps seeing in him a connection to their father's family that transcended the old hatreds. Everything's ready, Mama, Eleanor reported. Mr. Abernathy gave us extra preserves for winter. That was kind of him. Rebecca smiled, helping Charlotte climb aboard. As they prepared to depart, Mason Hargrove approached on horseback, his expression solemn but no longer burdened by the weight of decades of bitterness. Mitchell, he greeted Silas, I wanted to see you before you left town. Silas nodded in acknowledgement. Something on your mind, Hargrove? Mason dismounted, removing his hat respectfully as he addressed Rebecca and the girls as well. I've been thinking about our grandfathers, how they started as partners before the railroad drove them apart. Seems to me there's a lesson there. About the danger of letting others write your story, Silas suggested. Partly that, Mason agreed, but also about the strength that comes from cooperation rather than conflict. He gestured to the valley spreading below them. This land was meant to be shared. James Mitchell and Thomas Hargrove understood that before greed and misunderstanding poisoned everything. What are you proposing? Rebecca asked. Mason straightened his decision, evidently made. A formal end to the feud. A written agreement between our families combining our efforts to rebuild what the railroad nearly destroyed. Silas studied the older man, searching for any hint of deception, and finding none. You're serious? Never more so, Mason confirmed. For my part, I'm establishing a trust in Daniel's nameland set aside for the common good of redemption. A park, perhaps, or a school. Something that honors what he tried to do. Eleanor's eyes widened. A school Papa would have loved that. He was always teaching us things. Mason smiled at the girl. Then a school it shall be, with a library full of books, so knowledge can never again be buried or forgotten. The gesture was unexpected and deeply meaningful, a tangible acknowledgement of Daniel's sacrifice and a commitment to a different future. I think that's a fine idea, Silas said at last, extending his hand. A new beginning for both our families. As they shook hands, Rebecca watched with undisguised emotion, one arm around each of her daughters. The cycle of hatred that had claimed her husband might finally be broken, allowing his children to grow up in a community built on truth rather than generations of manufactured animosity. The journey back to the Mitchell cabin was made in thoughtful silence, each passenger reflecting on the extraordinary events of the past weeks. For Silas, the landscape seemed different, somehow more vibrant, more alive with possibility. The burden of isolation he had carried since Catherine's death felt lighter, replaced by a new sense of purpose and connection. As they crested the final hill overlooking the property, the setting sun bathed everything in golden light. The cabin, the small barn, the creek winding through the meadow. It wasn't grand or imposing like the Hargrove Ranch, but it was solid, honest, a place where healing could begin. Charlotte, who had been dozing against her mother, suddenly sat up straight, pointing excitedly. Home, she said clearly, her voice still a rarity that drew everyone's attention. Rebecca smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. Yes, sweetheart, home for now. Eleanor leaned forward from her seat beside Silas. "Can we plant a garden? Papa always said this soil was good for growing things." "Of course," Silas replied, surprised by how natural it felt to plan for a future that included them. "Come spring, we'll plant whatever you like." As they approached the cabin, Silas noticed something he hadn't seen before, a small carving on the porch post. Looking closer, he recognized the initials J.M. and T.H. intertwined in a pattern similar to the one on the metal box they'd found at the hanging tree. They were here together, he realized aloud. Our grandfathers built this cabin as partners. Rebecca examined the carving, tracing the letters with her fingertips. "The beginning of everything," she murmured, "before the lies took root." "And now we've come full circle," Silas observed, "ending where they began." That evening, as Rebecca prepared a simple meal and the girls explored their new surroundings, Silas sat on the porch, watching the first stars appear in the deepening blue of twilight. The small wooden box that had contained Catherine's handkerchief and pendant rested in his palm, a tangible link to his past. For years he had kept it closed, guarding his grief as jealously as the box guarded its contents. Now he opened it one last time, removing the handkerchief and studying the delicate embroidery in the fading light. "I think you would approve," he whispered to Catherine's memory, "of them, of this new beginning." A soft footfall behind him announced Rebecca's presence. She carried 2 cups of coffee, offering one to him as she settled on the step beside him. "The girls are asleep," she said, smiling softly. "Charlotte, in mid-sentence as usual now that she's found her voice again." Silas accepted the coffee gratefully. "She's making up for lost time." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the night deepen over Whisper Creek Valley. The land that had witnessed so much conflict now lay peaceful under the emerging stars, as if finally exhaling after decades of tension. "What happens now?" Rebecca asked eventually, her voice quiet but steady. Silas considered the question, understanding its many layers. "Now we rebuild. Not just buildings or fences, but trust. Connections." He glanced at her. "Futures. It won't be easy," she cautioned. "The railroad may have retreated, but they haven't surrendered, and old hatreds die slowly." "Nothing worthwhile ever comes easily," Silas replied. "But for the first time in years, I believe it's possible." Rebecca's hand found his in the darkness, her touch hesitant but warm. "Daniel used to say that hope was the most powerful force in the world, stronger than hatred, stronger even than fear." "Wise man, my brother," Silas said softly, gently returning the pressure of her fingers. As night embraced Whisper Creek, a new understanding took root between them. Not romance, not yet, but the foundation of something that might grow, given time and care. 2 people who had lost much now facing forward together, guided by the truth their families had sacrificed to uncover. In the distance, coyotes called to one another across the valley, their voices carrying on the night air like ancient promises. Above, stars wheeled in their eternal patterns, witnessing another chapter in the story of this land and its people, a story no longer dictated by corporate greed or manufactured hatred, but written by those who had finally discovered the most valuable inheritance of all, the truth of their shared past and the freedom to determine their own future.